The cabin of the night flight glowed under the soft, pervasive yellow of artificial light. The engines maintained a steady, deep hum, a metallic lullaby as most passengers drifted between restless sleep and the tedium of transatlantic travel. In the narrow confines of row 10, pressed against the cold fuselage wall, a thin man in a visibly worn denim jacket slept lightly. An 8-year-old girl, Lily, rested against his chest, her small fingers instinctively gripping the sleeve of his coat, finding security in the rough fabric. From the quiet luxury of business class, separated only by a thin curtain, a man with silver hair and a sharp suit twisted in his seat. He spoke loudly enough for several rows to hear. "Why is someone like that sitting so close to us? It disrupts the atmosphere." People turned. A few passengers in the adjacent rows exchanged knowing glances, and some smirked with obvious superiority. A flight attendant, her smile tight and professional, knelt beside Ethan. Her voice was careful but her tone was firm, mandated by corporate policy. "Sir, would you mind moving toward the back? For everyone's comfort, perhaps?" The man, Ethan Ward, opened his eyes. They were gray and clear, despite the exhaustion etched around them. He didn't argue. He understood the subtext immediately. He gently nudged his daughter awake. Lily looked up, her expression confused and scared. "Daddy, did we do something wrong?" As he stood, gathering their few belongings, the captain's voice suddenly sliced through the pressurized calm, amplified by the intercom. "Attention, please. Is there a combat pilot on board?" The entire cabin froze. The man in row 10 froze too. His name was Ethan Ward. He was 36 years old, and for the past 5 years he had operated solely as a single father. At this moment, none of his private life mattered to the people surrounding him. To them, he was merely a tired man occupying row 10, wearing a faded, functional jacket that had long since surrendered its color to hard work. His shoes were scuffed, the leather cracked from misuse and neglect. His hands were broad and rough, the kind of hands shaped by long hours of manual punishing work. He took whatever jobs he could find. Quick mechanic fixes, grueling delivery driving shifts, short-term household repairs. Nothing permanent, nothing impressive. The ticket he held was the cheapest one he could possibly locate, a red-eye special chosen purely for economy. That was the singular reason he was on this flight. Ethan was taking Lily to visit her grandmother across the country. It had been nearly a year since they last went. Money had been tight and time had been tighter. When he finally spotted the discounted night flight, he hadn't hesitated. He had chosen row 10 on purpose. Years ago, in a life he no longer claimed, he had learned that seats near the wing structure felt inherently more stable during turbulence. Less shaking, less sudden drops. It was better for a child who struggled to find deep sleep. That detailed knowledge came from a past life he never spoke about, a life he had meticulously locked away in the deepest corner of his memory. By the time the plane had climbed to cruising altitude, Lily had already succumbed to sleep. She always did when she felt the unquestioning safety of his presence. Ethan pulled his jacket tighter around her shoulders, creating a makeshift blanket, and adjusted his arms so her head rested more comfortably against the solid wall of his chest. Only then did he permit himself to close his eyes. The day had been brutal, too long. He had pulled a 12-hour shift straight through, wrestling with a truck engine that simply refused to cooperate. His back still ached deeply, and his hands, no matter how hard he had scrubbed them with industrial soap, still carried the faint, acrid smell of spent oil. Exhaustion dragged him down faster than he anticipated, but he never truly slept in the civilian sense. Ethan was the kind of man who rested lightly, a hair-trigger sensitivity inherited from constant vigilance. Even with his eyes closed, he noticed the quick, dismissive glances from those who passed row 10 on their way back from the lavatory. The brief pauses, the subtle, superior judgment. From business class, the stares were sharper, longer. Well-dressed passengers, reclined comfortably with expensive drinks in hand, glanced toward the economy section with thinly veiled disdain. One man leaned close to another and whispered, loud enough to carry over the engine noise. "Some people should really just know their place." Ethan heard it, of course he did. He didn't react. Instead, he shifted slightly and adjusted Lily's position again, turning her small face inward so the words couldn't penetrate her sleep. He pulled the collar of his faded jacket higher, covering her ear with the fabric. His priority was simple, honed by years of single fatherhood. Let her sleep. Let her feel safe. That was the only variable that mattered. What no one noticed, lost in the noise and the judgment, was the small, almost invisible motion of his right hand. As Lily's breathing deepened and slowed, Ethan began tapping gently against his own thigh. A soft, steady rhythm. 2 taps, pause. 3 taps, pause. Then repeat. It wasn't random fidgeting. It was a practiced, grounding rhythm, a technique used to control breathing under extreme stress, to stabilize core functions when adrenaline surged, to keep the mind sharp in total chaos. 2 rows ahead in seat 2A, a woman glanced back. Her name was Arya Dalton. She was dressed elegantly in a sleek dark suit, her posture relaxed, her expression composed, the picture of an accomplished executive traveling business class. But she noticed things others didn't. Her eyes lingered on Ethan's hand, on the silent rhythm, on how his steady breathing matched its cadence perfectly. For a brief, sharp moment, something stirred in her memory. A cold briefing room, a high-stakes simulation, a voice explaining how specialized combat pilots stabilize themselves before executing critical maneuvers. She frowned slightly. That's impossible, she thought, quickly dismissing the anomaly. The man in row 10 is just a tired father. Nothing more. Arya turned back toward the front of the cabin, closing the door on the thought. Behind her, Ethan stopped tapping as Lily slept peacefully, utterly unaware that her father's carefully buried past was beginning to surface, quietly and dangerously, at 35,000 feet. The first jolt came without warning. A sudden, violent shudder that felt like the aircraft had slammed into a concrete wall of air. It was sharp, quick, and then the plane steadied again. A few gasps rippled through the cabin. Overhead bins rattled faintly. The seatbelt sign chimed on, glowing amber above every row. Lily stirred in her sleep, her fingers tightening into a vice grip around Ethan's jacket. "It's okay," he whispered softly, not fully awake himself. "Just a little bump." For a moment, the plane seemed to return to normal. Conversations nervously resumed. Screens flickered back to movies and flight maps. But the tension never truly dissipated. It lingered like smoke. Then came the second jolt. This time it was stronger, more prolonged. The plane dipped sharply enough to make several passengers cry out in fear. Drinks sloshed over trays. Someone screamed loudly from the back rows. A nervous, forced laugh followed, too loud and brittle to be genuine. In business class, irritation quickly replaced fear. A man stood halfway up from his seat, gripping the headrest in front of him for support. His voice cut sharply through the murmuring cabin. "This is ridiculous. Why are we shaking like this? This is unacceptable." Another passenger, looking wild-eyed, pointed instinctively toward the economy section, straight at row 10. "And why is he still sitting there? He looks unstable, dangerous." The word hung in the air, heavy with accusation. Dangerous. Heads turned. Eyes locked onto Ethan. A woman shook her head openly, visibly disgusted. Someone else muttered, "Unbelievable entitlement." The judgment was no longer subtle. It was loud, public, and cruel. Ethan opened his eyes fully now. He felt Lily tense against him, her breathing hitched. She was awake. The flight attendant returned, her expression stretched tight, the professional strain visible beneath the practiced smile. "Sir," she said, her voice quiet but strained, "I'm gonna need you to move now. It's for everyone's comfort and to maintain order." Ethan looked up at her, then at the ring of hostile faces watching him. He nodded once. "I understand," he said calmly, with no trace of anger or defense. He carefully unbuckled his seatbelt, then Lily's. She clung to him, her small arms wrapping fiercely around his neck. "I don't want to move," she whispered, her voice shaking violently. "I know," Ethan replied. "Just stay close to me." As he stood and stepped into the narrow aisle, The whispers intensified. About time. Should have been in the back from the start. People like that always cause problems. Ethan kept his head down, focused only on Lily. He took one step forward, preparing to move toward the back of the aircraft, when the plane lurched violently. This time there was no mistaking the severity. The nose dipped steeply. The engines roared unevenly, straining against something invisible. The cabin filled with shrieks and full-throated screams. Oxygen masks shook loose above several rows, dangling uselessly in the sudden hard drop. The intercom crackled deafeningly. Then the captain's voice cut through, no longer measured or calm. It was raw panic. If there is any combat pilot on board, this is an emergency. Please respond immediately. The words slammed into the cabin, silencing the screams. Silence followed. A heavy, suffocating blanket of dread. Business class froze. Economy froze. Fear settled thick and tangible in the air. Ethan stopped walking. His posture changed instantaneously. The profound exhaustion that had weighed him down moments earlier evaporated as if shed skin. His broad shoulders straightened. His spine went rigid. His breathing slowed, deep, controlled, the rhythmic intake and exhale of a man accustomed to zero-margin decisions. He looked down at Lily and crouched immediately to her eye level. "Stay here," he said softly, his voice utterly steady. "Close your eyes. Hold your seat." "But, Daddy, I'll be right back." He pressed his forehead gently to hers for a moment of quiet connection, then stood up and turned toward the front of the plane, moving against the flow of the emergency. A man, the same man from business class who had complained, stepped into the aisle, blocking him. "Sit down," he snapped, his face pale with fear but his voice still laced with arrogance. "You're not a pilot. Don't make this worse by panicking." Ethan looked at him. His gaze was steady, cold, not fueled by anger, but by focused, immediate necessity. "Move," Ethan said quietly. Something in that single word, that absolute authority, made the man hesitate and then step aside, without fully comprehending why he had obeyed. Ethan moved forward. Each step down the aisle was deliberate, balanced, and precise. His hands brushed the backs of the seats instinctively, steadying himself with practiced ease as the plane continued to shake and strain. Arya Dalton stood up from seat 2A, her heart beginning to pound rapidly against her ribs. She watched him approach. It wasn't just the way he walked. It was the timing, the hyper-awareness, the way he adjusted his steps to the plane's random, violent movements. He leaned slightly forward, as if already compensating for the next bout of severe turbulence. This was not a civilian. This was not a mechanic. She had seen this posture before, years ago, in places and during moments most people never knew existed. The cockpit door was already open, a flight attendant shouting urgently into the chaos inside. Ethan reached the door just as the plane dipped sharply again. He grabbed the frame with one hand, grounding himself instantly, absorbing the shock through his shoulder and arm. Inside, pure chaos reigned. Warning alarms blared in overlapping dissonance. Red lights flashed maniacally across the instrument panel. The co-pilot clutched his headset, pure panic flooding his eyes. The captain's left hand was bleeding, a shallow but painful cut from striking the console during the last violent shake. They both looked up. The captain stared at Ethan, disbelief washing over his sweat-streaked face. "You were sleeping in row 10? Ethan didn't waste time on the disbelief. "Tell me what you lost," he said calmly, his voice cutting through the noise. The simplicity of the question instantly commanded their attention. The co-pilot blinked. "Autopilot disengaged. Sensors are giving conflicting data." Ethan nodded once, already absorbing the situation. "I'll take the right seat." He moved without waiting for permission. As he sat down, his hands settled naturally on the controls, fingers curved, wrists aligned, posture perfect, military perfect. Outside the cockpit, Arya watched through the narrow opening, holding her breath. There was no doubt left. The man who had just been humiliated in row 10 was not who anyone thought he was. And the immediate fate of the flight now rested entirely in his hands. Inside the cockpit, the noise was relentless. Warning alarms pulsed in sharp, electronic intervals. Red indicators flashed across every panel. The aircraft pitched slightly left, corrected sluggishly, then dipped again. Outside the windows, thick, bruised clouds swallowed the night entirely. The captain pressed a bandage to his injured hand and looked at Ethan again, searching his face for certainty in the midst of total uncertainty. "What's your experience?" he asked quickly, urgently. Ethan didn't look away from the instruments. "Multiple airframes," he said simply. "Sit down. High-threat environments. Manual recovery under sensor failure." The co-pilot stared at him. Those were not civilian words. Ethan scanned the display with practiced, lightning speed, airspeed, angle of attack, altitude fluctuations. Conflicting pitot data, he stated, his jaw tightening as he reached a rapid conclusion. Angle of attack sensor is lying. Pitot tubes are giving delayed pressure readings. The autopilot trusted the bad data and kicked itself offline. The co-pilot shook his head frantically. "We followed procedure. And procedure is killing you right now," Ethan cut in, calm but utterly firm. He pointed to a system toggle that most commercial pilots never touched outside of training manuals, a relic of maximum control systems. "Disable that channel," Ethan ordered. "Now, sir." The captain hesitated. "That's not standard protocol." "Standard is gone," Ethan replied, his voice a low rumble of command. "You want stable flight or you want permission?" The plane shuddered violently, dropping hard enough to throw unsecured items across the floor, answering the question for them. The captain nodded grimly. "Do it." The co-pilot flipped the switch. Several loud, shrieking alarms went silent at once. The sudden, unnatural quiet felt almost deafening. Ethan adjusted the trim manually, his movements precise and controlled, like sculpting clay. The aircraft leveled slightly, still shaking, but no longer fighting against its own systems. "Hold this pitch," Ethan directed. "Don't chase the numbers. Fly the feel." The co-pilot swallowed hard and obeyed instantly. Outside the cockpit, Aria Dalton stood frozen. She had pushed past the flight attendant without registering the action. Her eyes were locked on Ethan's hands, on how lightly they rested on the controls, on how he never overcorrected, never rushed a movement. This was not talent. This was years of ingrained conditioning. Her gaze dropped to his wrist as he reached forward. The sleeve of his faded jacket pulled back slightly, revealing a faint, diagonal scar running across his skin, old, healed badly, clearly not from a simple accident. It was the kind of scar that came from immense impact or an emergency ejection. Her heart skipped a beat. "Shadow Wing," she whispered under her breath. Ethan didn't look at her, but he didn't deny the name either. The captain glanced between them, confused. "You know him?" Aria stepped fully into the cockpit now, the harsh hum of power surrounding her. "I know the unit," she said carefully. "Not the man." Ethan's eyes flicked to her for half a second, then immediately back to the cloud-darkened sky ahead. "Focus on the plane," he said. Another brutal wave of turbulence hit. The nose dipped again, sharper this time. The co-pilot gasped. Ethan reacted instantly, countering the roll with swift manual input, stabilizing the aircraft before the movement could escalate into a loss of control. "Ride it," Ethan commanded. "Don't fight it. Let it pass." Seconds stretched into an eternity. The plane shook violently, then slowly, hesitantly, steadied. The captain exhaled shakily. "We almost lost altitude control completely." "You did," Ethan said. "We got it back." Aria watched him closely. "You didn't answer the captain's question," she pressed softly. "Why did you leave?" For the first time, Ethan paused. Not his hands, not his concentration on the plane, but his voice carried a deep weight of pain. "My wife died," he said quietly. "Same year I left the unit." The cockpit fell silent save for the mechanical hum of the straining engines. "She was a civilian," Ethan continued, keeping his eyes forward. "Killed in a crash. Commercial flight. Weather misjudgment. Pilot error." Arya's chest tightened in sudden, painful understanding. "I stayed airborne after that," Ethan said. "Did my job. Finished my missions. But every time I strapped in, All I saw was my daughter growing up without a father, just like I saw her growing up without a mother. He adjusted the trim again, settling them into a steady, shallow climb. So I landed, he said, for good. The co-pilot didn't speak. Neither did the captain. Lily. That was the reason. Ethan kept his eyes fixed ahead. She's 8. She sleeps better when she can hear my heartbeat. Another deep pocket of turbulence slammed into them. This one was far worse than the last. The plane yawned violently. Altitude dropped alarmingly fast. A new, terrifying alarm screamed to life. Severe wind shear. The co-pilot shouted, panic rising again in his voice. We're losing lift. Ethan leaned forward slightly, his voice unwavering. Absolute focus overriding the chaos. He killed the autothrottle immediately. Right now, he said, I'll manage thrust manually. That's insane, the co-pilot yelled. We're not trained for that. I am, Ethan replied. The captain met Ethan's eyes, saw the cold, determined certainty there. Do it, he ordered. The engines responded unevenly as Ethan took complete manual control over the power delivery. He compensated instantly, adjusting thrust asymmetrically to counter the brutal crosswind shearing their wings. His movements were small, incredibly efficient, almost gentle. Cloud density will break in 12 seconds, Ethan predicted, his eyes glued to the outside. When it does, we climb. Not before. How do you know that? Arya demanded. Ethan didn't answer. He counted silently under his breath. *10, 9, 8. The turbulence eased slightly just as he finished the count. Now, Ethan said. He increased thrust smoothly, powerfully, lifting the nose just enough. The aircraft surged upward, breaking through the dense cloud layer into clear, star-scattered air. The shaking stopped. The alarms fell silent. For the first time in agonizing minutes, the plane flew straight and stable. The co-pilot slumped back in his seat, breathing hard, his face pale with shock. It held on, he whispered. The captain stared out at the quiet horizon, disbelief written across his face, now mixed with profound relief. You saved us, he said quietly. Ethan didn't respond. He loosened his grip on the control column slightly but remained entirely alert. We'll divert, the captain announced, regaining his professional tone. Emergency landing near a suitable runway. Ethan nodded. I'll stay until the approach is stable. Outside the cockpit, the cabin remained deathly tense, completely unaware of how close they had come to total disaster. Back in row 10, Lily sat alone, hugging her knees tightly, eyes squeezed shut exactly as her father had instructed. She counted her breaths. *1, 2, 3. She didn't know why she trusted him so completely. She just did. Inside the cockpit, Arya looked at Ethan again, seeing him clearly now. Not as the exhausted, despised man in row 10, but as someone who had once carried lives through the squall and then chosen to come down, to walk away from the sky, for love. And she realized something else. The humiliation he endured earlier wasn't an accident of class. It was the constant, quiet cost of walking away from the duty he carried in his bones. And now, at 35,000 feet, the past had caught up with him. The descent began smoothly, almost gently, like the atmosphere itself was finally relenting. The captain coordinated with air traffic control, his voice still tight but steady now. The co-pilot followed instructions with visibly shaking hands, trying to regain the rhythm of normal procedure. Ethan stayed in the right seat, eyes forward, posture unchanged. He didn't celebrate. He didn't speak unless necessary. When the runway lights finally appeared through the dark, the cabin felt the difference immediately. The violent shaking was gone. The screaming had stopped. Passengers sat in stunned silence, listening intently to the sounds of the engines, the deployment of the flaps, the careful changes in pitch. Fear still lingered, but it was no longer a wild animal. It had been contained. The landing was firm but safe. Tires hit the runway with a heavy, satisfying thump, followed by a long, controlled roll. The braking was steady and purposeful. The aircraft slowed, turning off toward the emergency vehicles waiting in a brilliant line of flashing red and blue lights. For a second, the plane was absolutely silent. Then the cabin erupted. People cried. People laughed hysterically. People clapped without thinking. A spontaneous, unified noise of raw relief. Strangers hugged strangers. Someone whispered, "Thank God," again and again, like a prayer they couldn't stop reciting. The captain's voice came over the speakers, calmer now but thick with emotion. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have landed safely. This was an emergency diversion. Thank you for staying seated, and thank you to the passenger who stepped forward when we needed help the most." Applause swelled again, louder this time. Heads turned toward the front. Some people stood in the aisle, craning their necks, desperate to see the hero they had imagined. A uniform, a confident, older man, someone polished, someone who belonged. They didn't expect Ethan. Ethan didn't wait for the attention. The moment the cockpit door opened, he stepped out quickly and moved down the aisle, ignoring the hands reaching toward him, ignoring the voices calling out, "Asterisk, sir. Thank you. Are you military?" Asterisk. He didn't answer. He walked straight back to row 10. Lily was still there, small and rigid, clutching her own arms as if holding herself together. Her eyes were wide, fixed on his approach. She wasn't crying. She looked like she had been brave for too long. Ethan dropped to his knees beside her. "It's okay," he said softly. "I'm here." Lily threw her arms around his neck, so hard it almost knocked him off balance. Her body shook violently, and only then did she begin to cry. A deep, cleansing release. Ethan held her close, one hand cradling the back of her head. "You did perfect," he whispered into her hair. "You listened. I'm proud of you." Lily pulled back just enough to look at him, her voice trembling. "Daddy, are you a hero?" Ethan's expression softened. A small, tired smile touched his mouth. "No," he said. "I'm just your dad." Behind them, the cabin shifted. The people who had mocked him earlier now stood frozen in deep shame. The business-class man who had called him someone like that couldn't meet Ethan's eyes. His face was pale. His mouth opened once, then closed, because he knew whatever words he might utter would sound too small, too hollow. A woman who had smirked earlier stepped closer, her hands clasped tightly. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, truthfully. "I am truly sorry." Others followed suit, offering small apologies, their voices broken, their eyes lowered. The kind of regret that arrives late but still burns with realization. Then Arya Dalton appeared in the aisle. She moved with calm authority, but her face was profoundly different now. The composure remained, yet something deeper had surfaced in her eyes. Respect, humility, and perhaps even guilt for her own initial dismissal. She stopped beside Ethan and Lily. For a moment she didn't speak. Then she lowered her head slightly, not as a gesture for the crowd, but as if she needed Ethan to know it was real. "You sat in row 10, she said softly. "But you carried the escape." Ethan looked up at her. His gaze was steady, but there was no pride in it. "I did what anyone should do," he said. Arya shook her head slowly. "Not everyone can." The aisle behind her was filled with watching faces now. People who had been cruel, people who had been afraid, people who had survived because a quiet man in an old jacket stood up anyway. Ethan didn't look at them. He tightened his arms around his daughter and focused only on her breathing, matching its rhythm to his own steady heartbeat. Outside the windows, emergency lights flashed across the wet runway. Inside, the truth settled into the cabin like a weight. Honor had never belonged to the seat number. It belonged entirely to the moment when someone rose when everyone else stayed frozen. The aircraft sat motionless on the runway as emergency crews finished their external checks. Slowly, the remaining tension drained from the cabin. Passengers remained seated longer than necessary, as if standing too quickly might break something fragile that had been repaired. Ethan stayed in row 10. He didn't give interviews. He didn't answer questions. When a flight attendant approached and quietly asked for his name for the required incident report, he gave it politely. Then, he asked only one thing in return. "Please let my daughter get off first. She's tired." The controlled chaos ended the moment they crossed the threshold of the emergency exit. Stepping down the temporary stairs, the sudden expanse of the tarmac felt immense. The cool, crisp night air, smelling faintly of jet fuel and rain, was a shocking, welcome contrast to the stale cabin oxygen. It swept over their skin, cleansing the residue of panic. Lily didn't just hold his hand. Her entire small body was anchored to him, her grip tenacious. Her fingers were fused around his own, a silent, desperate confirmation that the ground was solid and he was still hers, a fear that he might vanish if she released her hold for even a second. Hours later, when the debriefings were done and the last of the passengers had been routed toward hotels or connecting flights, the airport was hushed. The captain, whose name Ethan barely knew, found him in a sterile, temporary terminal office. This time, the captain came alone. There was no glare of a camera crew, no PR representative dictating talking points. In his hand, he held a single, slightly creased sheet of thick paper. "I wrote this myself," the captain admitted, his voice low. "Not the company memo. This is personal." The note was stark, simple, and overwhelmingly genuine. It was a testament of gratitude for the steady, unyielding control Ethan had displayed, for the cold, clear judgment that had prioritized every soul on board, for saving them all without pausing to calculate the cost. Ethan read the few lines silently. The sincerity of the gesture outweighed any official commendation. He refolded the paper with deliberate care, smoothing the edges before slipping it into the inner pocket of his jacket. "Thank you," he replied, the two words carrying the weight of shared experience. Arya Dalton had waited patiently in the periphery until the captain departed. She didn't approach immediately. She stood a few steps away, unassuming, not flanked by aides or security, just a woman who had witnessed the full spectrum of that evening. The raw technical skill of a pilot carrying a metal tube full of frightened strangers, and the immediate humanity of a father dropping everything to embrace his daughter. She extended a crisp white card toward him. "If you ever find yourself wanting to fly again," she said softly, ensuring her tone held no demand, only possibility. "Not for duty or for war, but simply for the purpose of it, call me." Ethan looked at the card but left his hand resting at his side. He didn't rush to accept the invitation back into the atmosphere. "I don't know if I belong up there anymore," he confessed, the statement quiet but heavy, his gaze drifting toward the pane of glass separating them from the vast, dark expanse of the midnight sky. Arya offered a rare, knowing smile. She understood the internal conflict of leaving one life for another. "Belonging is fluid," she countered. "It changes its shape and its location. But that doesn't mean the essence of what you are disappears." He finally reached out, taking the card, feeling the smooth texture between his fingers. He placed it carefully next to the captain's letter. "I'll think about it," he promised. For Ethan, burdened by history and responsibility, that cautious phrase was the nearest thing to a commitment he could offer. As they finally walked away from the structured lights of the terminal, Lily leaned heavily into her father, her steps tired, her body swaying slightly. She let out a soft, breathy yawn. "Daddy," she mumbled, her voice thick with exhaustion and lingering emotion. "When I was scared up there, I listened to your heartbeat. It was the only thing I could hear." Ethan stopped, pulling her close, burying his face in her hair. He felt the pure, simple truth of her observation. "I know, sweet girl," he whispered, kissing the crown of her head, "and I was listening to yours." They slipped out of the airport and into the anonymity of the night. There was no gathering crowd, no flash of cameras, no applause, just the quiet, sacred sound of their footsteps retreating together. By the first light of dawn, the digital world would already be devouring the event. The story would travel instantly, across every screen, through hurried news alerts, and in words that, no matter how dramatic, could never truly encapsulate the 2 minutes between disaster and salvation. But Ethan had everything he needed. He didn't require the headline. He had the reality walking beside him. Some men carried the gleaming weight of medals. Some carried the power inherent in titles. Others carried the internal geography of scars they would never bother to explain. Ethan carried something infinitely more vital. He carried his child home, having stared down the sky when it threatened to claim everything he loved. That night offered a visceral reminder of a truth often lost in the noise of modern life. the quietest souls frequently bear the heaviest histories. True honor is rarely ostentatious. It doesn't reside exclusively in the elite comfort of first class, nor does it demand a spotlight. It is inherently humble. It shows up, performs the necessary act when all else fails, and then, without fanfare, quietly retreats back to row 10. Never define a person solely by their present seat assignment, their attire, or the depth of their silence. Some individuals have shouldered responsibilities heavier than most of us can comprehend. They operated at altitudes few dare to reach, facing down genuine peril so that countless others could live in secure ignorance. And then, one ordinary day, they chose to descend. They chose to land not out of weakness, surrender, or fear, but because the call of duty on the ground, the desperate need of one small person, outweighed the glory of the sky. Authentic strength is never loud. True honor seeks no validation, and real heroes operate without any expectation of recognition. When the earth shifts and the moment of decision arrives, they simply rise, they act decisively, they protect what is precious, and when the crisis passes, they melt back into the anonymity of silence. Because the single most important, enduring title a person can ever possess, more significant than pilot, soldier, or even hero, is father. If you agree that real heroism requires no public acclaim, if you understand that dignity is found in the quiet choices made behind closed doors, and if stories like this resonate deep within, reminding you of the commitments that truly define a life, then subscribe to this channel. Here, we tell the narratives of honor, of profound sacrifice, and of the fathers who prioritize love above all glory.